Teresa opens her restaurant, genuinely confident, savings poured in, recipes perfected over years of cooking for friends and family, a dream she'd been quietly building toward for nearly a decade. A relative pulls her aside at the opening and says gently, 90% of restaurants fail in the first year. You know that, right? Meant as loving concern, but landing like a countdown clock she hadn't asked for. Teresa's restaurant is still open, 5 years later. That specific number her relative quoted, the one basically everyone in America has heard at some point, isn't real. It never was. Here's the number that should stop you mid-scroll. The actual first-year failure rate for restaurants, according to real research using verified business data, sits somewhere between 14 and 26%. And one large study using federal labor data found restaurants specifically fail at a slightly lower rate than the average service business in year one. Lower, not higher. This isn't a video telling you restaurants are secretly easy, or that opening one is a safe bet by any reasonable definition of that word. It's a video about where that famous 90% number actually came from, why it's stuck around for over 2 decades, despite being completely wrong from the very beginning, and what the real, more alarming pattern in restaurant economics actually looks like once you stop chasing a fake statistic and start looking at what the genuine research actually says. Let me show you what the research actually found. My name is Alex, and today on Wealth Adjacent, we're taking apart the industry everyone thinks is doomed for the wrong reason entirely. Quick disclaimer, not financial advice, just documented data from published hospitality research, presented as accurately and carefully as the underlying studies genuinely allow. Let's meet Teresa. Careful planner, wrote a real business plan, secured real financing. She'd heard the 90% statistic so many times before opening that she genuinely expected to be the exception rather than the rule. Here's where that number actually came from. In 2003, a reality television show called The Restaurant aired, following a celebrity chef opening a new establishment. And during the show, he specifically claimed that 90% of new restaurants fail in their first year, and that he intended to beat those odds. A dramatic, memorable line that made for genuinely compelling television but had no actual research behind it whatsoever. Millions of people watched, and the number simply stuck, repeated afterward in articles, business plans, and cautionary conversations for the next 2 decades, passed along by people who'd never once traced it back to its actual source. Here's the part that should make you sit up. Researchers at Cornell specifically went looking for where that 90% figure actually originated in the academic literature, doing an extensive review of every published study they could find on restaurant failure rates, and found nothing. No study anywhere had ever produced that number. It wasn't a rounding error or an outdated statistic that had simply been misquoted along the way. It simply didn't exist as real research at all, a completely fabricated figure that had somehow achieved the status of common knowledge. So the same researchers ran the actual math themselves, using real business turnover data collected across multiple markets over a decade. They found a first-year failure rate closer to 26%, and when they modeled what a genuine 90% failure rate would actually do to the total number of restaurants in a market over 20 years, running the simulation forward year by year, the math didn't hold up at all. The industry would have shrunk dramatically, losing the vast majority of its total restaurant count, instead of the steady growth actually observed in the real world over that same period. There's a separate, more recent study worth naming too, since it adds real weight to the correction and confirms the pattern wasn't simply a one-time finding. Researchers using federal labor statistics, tracking over 80,000 restaurants over nearly 2 decades in a rigorous, large-scale longitudinal analysis, found a first-year failure rate of about 17%, specifically lower than the 19% failure rate for all other service-providing businesses combined during that same period. Restaurants, it turns out, aren't unusually fragile in year one at all. They're actually slightly more durable than the average small business, a genuinely surprising finding once you set the fake statistic aside and look at what the real data actually shows. Read that again, because it directly contradicts what almost everyone assumes about this industry, including plenty of people who've never actually looked at the underlying research themselves. A new dental practice, a new law office, a new consulting firm, all fail at a higher rate in year one than a new restaurant does, according to this specific dataset, which runs completely against the popular image of restaurants as uniquely, catastrophically risky compared to more respectable professional businesses. The stereotype of restaurants being the riskiest possible venture simply isn't supported by the actual numbers, however deeply ingrained that assumption has become in popular culture. So if the 90% figure is fake, why does the restaurant industry feel so genuinely precarious? Why does everyone seem to know a restaurant that closed suddenly? Here's where the real, more interesting pattern actually shows up. It's not that restaurants fail unusually fast. It's that they operate on unusually thin margins the entire time they're open, which makes them look fragile constantly, even while surviving at roughly normal rates. Here's the actual mechanism behind that. Average restaurant profit margins typically sit somewhere between 3 and 5%, dramatically thinner than most other small business categories, which often operate with margins several times higher even when the underlying revenue is comparable. A restaurant doing $1 million in annual revenue might be clearing only $30,000 to $50,000 in actual profit after every expense is accounted for, meaning even a small disruption, a slow month, a rent increase, an unexpected repair, an ingredient cost spike can push an otherwise healthy business into the red almost immediately, with very little cushion built into the model to absorb it. That thin margin reality is what actually explains the visible churn people notice on their own street. It's not that an unusually high number of restaurants open and fail within 12 months. It's that restaurants operate close enough to break even, permanently, that a genuinely ordinary bad stretch, one any business might survive comfortably with more cushion, can be enough to close the doors. There's a specific pattern worth naming around what actually drives closures, since it's rarely one single dramatic event, but usually a slow accumulation of smaller pressures. Undercapitalization consistently ranks as one of the top causes across nearly every study on this topic, meaning a restaurant simply didn't have enough cash reserves to survive the genuinely normal, slow ramp-up most new businesses experience before reaching consistent profitability. A ramp-up that can easily take a year or more even for a restaurant that eventually becomes successful. Location choice ranks close behind, since foot traffic and visibility in this specific industry translate almost directly into revenue in a way that's less true for businesses that don't depend on walk-in customers finding them by chance. There's a specific detail worth naming that catches a lot of new owners off guard, since it's rarely mentioned in the genuine excitement of finally opening a place they've dreamed about for years. Many first-time restaurant owners underestimate their actual startup costs by a meaningful margin, sometimes 30 to 50% below what the business genuinely required to reach stable footing. Which means the undercapitalization problem often starts before the doors even open, baked into the original budget itself, months before the first customer ever walks through the door. Let's return to Teresa specifically, since the abstract research becomes considerably more concrete once it's tied back to an actual comparison. Her restaurant survived, but not because she beat some mythical 90% survival lottery that never actually existed in the first place. She survived because she deliberately overcapitalized before opening, kept 6 months of operating expenses in reserves, specifically because a mentor warned her the thin margin reality would eventually test her, not because of any single dramatic risk, but because of the accumulated weight of small, ordinary disruptions over time, the kind that rarely make it into anyone's cautionary opening night speech. That single decision, holding real reserves instead of opening with the bare minimum, is precisely the kind of unglamorous preparation that doesn't show up in inspirational restaurant opening stories, but shows up constantly in the actual research on what separates survivors from closures. There's a specific detail worth naming that's genuinely more alarming than the fake 90% statistic ever was, precisely because it's real. Recent industry data suggests a meaningful share of restaurants currently operating, somewhere around 40% by some estimates, are entering a given year already unprofitable, not closed, not failed, just quietly operating in the red month after month, absorbing the loss rather than shutting down outright. That's a genuinely different, more chronic kind of risk than a dramatic first-year cliff, and arguably a more useful thing to actually understand and plan around. There's a specific pattern worth naming around the survival curve over time too, since the picture does get genuinely more sobering the further out you look, well beyond that misleadingly famous first year. While first-year failure sits in that 14 to 26% range, depending on the specific study, roughly half of all restaurants have closed by the 5-year mark, and by 10 years, the cumulative failure rate climbs to around 70%, a genuinely high number that just happens to be spread across a full decade instead of compressed into a single dramatic opening year the way the myth implies. There's a specific detail worth naming around franchise versus independent restaurants too, since it's a distinction people often assume matters more than it actually does, based on how franchise systems tend to market themselves as the inherently safer choice. Research comparing the two found only a modest difference in failure rates, independent restaurants failing at roughly 61% over 3 years compared to about 57% for franchises. A real gap worth acknowledging honestly, but nowhere near the dramatic safety net franchise marketing sometimes implies to prospective owners weighing the higher upfront franchise fees against that promised security. There's also a specific comparison worth naming that puts the restaurant industry's actual risk profile into clearer context, beyond just the single first-year statistic already covered. Professional service businesses, dental practices, law offices, medical clinics show meaningfully higher survival rates than restaurants over the long run, largely because those businesses typically carry considerably higher profit margins and don't depend on the kind of daily foot traffic and perishable inventory that defines restaurant economics specifically, giving them considerably more room to absorb a genuinely bad month or quarter without it threatening the entire operation. It's worth naming why the 90% myth was so easy to believe in the first place, since understanding that helps explain why it spread as far and as fast as it did, well beyond one television show. Restaurant closures are specifically visible in a way most business failures simply aren't. A closed storefront on a familiar street corner, a sign in the window, a dark dining room where there used to be laughter and clinking glasses, gets noticed by hundreds of people who walk past it daily, while a failed consulting firm or an unsuccessful freelance business closes quietly, invisibly, with no physical location for anyone passing by to ever notice at all. That visibility bias means restaurant failures feel more common than they statistically are, simply because each one is publicly physically obvious in a way most small business failures never are, creating exactly the kind of environment where a fabricated 90% statistic could spread unchallenged for decades without anyone stopping to check the actual math behind it. Since every closed restaurant sighting quietly reinforced a number nobody had actually verified. There's a specific pattern worth naming around cash flow timing too, since it explains why thin margins are especially dangerous specifically in the restaurant industry compared to other thin margin businesses. Restaurants carry genuinely perishable inventory, meaning unsold food becomes a direct, immediate loss rather than something that can simply sit in a warehouse until demand picks back up. Combine that with labor costs that stay relatively fixed regardless of how busy a given week actually is, and a restaurant has less flexibility to simply wait out a slow stretch than a business selling non-perishable goods might have. Now, let me address the obvious objection directly, since this specific topic tends to invite it immediately. Isn't correcting this statistic a little beside the point? Doesn't a 26% first-year failure rate still mean opening a restaurant is genuinely risky, regardless of which specific number gets used? Completely fair, and worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. A 1 in 4 chance of failing within a year is still a real, meaningful risk, considerably higher than many other career or investment decisions someone might reasonably make instead. This video isn't claiming restaurants are safe. It's specifically correcting a number that's roughly 3 times too high, since the difference between planning around a 90% failure rate and a 26% one leads to genuinely different, more useful decisions about how much capital to raise and how long a runway to plan for. There's a second objection worth naming too, since it follows naturally from the first. If margins are genuinely this thin across the entire industry, doesn't that argue people should simply avoid opening restaurants altogether, since the math sounds discouraging no matter which specific statistic gets used? Worth taking seriously rather than dismissing outright. Thin margins mean the business model requires real discipline and real capital reserves to execute successfully, not that success is impossible or even unusually rare compared to other small business categories. The restaurants that do survive past the fragile early years frequently become genuinely durable, profitable businesses precisely because the operators who make it through have already been forced to build the financial discipline the thin margin model demands from day one. So here's the actual framework worth understanding. Whether you're considering opening a restaurant yourself, or just trying to understand why they seem to close so often on your own street. Plan around the real first-year failure rate, roughly 1 in 4 to 1 in 5, not the mythical 9 in 10 that's been repeated so widely for so long, since realistic planning produces genuinely different, more useful preparation than planning around a number that was never true in the first place. Overcapitalize deliberately rather than opening with the bare minimum, since the thin margin reality means even a modest cash cushion can be the specific difference between surviving an ordinary rough patch and becoming another closure statistic added to that real 26%. A few practical moves fall out of that. Budget for startup costs at least 30 to 50% higher than initial estimates, since that specific underestimate shows up consistently in the research on what actually sinks new restaurants, far more consistently than any single dramatic event ever does. Treat location and foot traffic analysis as seriously as the menu itself, since revenue in this specific industry depends on visibility in a way it doesn't for most other small businesses that don't rely on walk-in customers. And build reserves specifically sized for the ordinary, unglamorous disruptions, a slow month, a broken piece of equipment, a rent increase, not just a single catastrophic scenario that may never actually happen at all. There's one more detail worth naming before wrapping up, since it ties the entire correction back to something genuinely practical for anyone actually weighing this decision. Investors and lenders who base their risk assessments on the fake 90% figure tend to price restaurant loans and financing considerably more conservatively than the real data actually justifies, meaning the myth doesn't just mislead prospective owners, it can also make legitimate financing genuinely harder and more expensive to secure in the first place. A real, measurable cost the fabricated statistic has quietly imposed on the entire industry for over 2 decades. So here's where we land. This isn't about restaurants being secretly safe or the risk being overstated entirely, since a real meaningful risk genuinely exists throughout this entire industry. It's about understanding the actual shape of that risk, thin margins sustained over years, rather than a fake statistic about the first 12 months that's been repeated so often, by so many people, for so long, that it simply stopped getting questioned by anyone along the way. Teresa now mentors first-time restaurant owners specifically on capitalization and cash reserves, the unglamorous groundwork that never makes it into the inspiring version of a restaurant's opening story, but shows up quietly and consistently in every version of the ones that actually survive past their first, second, and fifth year. The point was never that restaurants are doomed or that they're secretly easy either, since neither extreme reflects what the actual research shows. It's that the real risk in this industry has always been about endurance through thin margins sustained over years, not a dramatic first-year cliff that most restaurants were never actually standing on in the first place, no matter how many times that specific number got repeated as though it were simply common knowledge.
If you're considering opening a restaurant or just trying to understand why one down the street closed recently, remember the real number is closer to 1 in 4, not 9 in 10, and the real risk is thinner margins for longer, not a single make-or-break year that most restaurants were never actually facing in the way the myth suggested.
If this helped, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, had you heard the 90% statistic before this? And did you know it was never actually real research to begin with? I'll see you in the next one.